The sun hung low and mean over Ash Hollow, baking the earth into cracked plates of dust. The salt depot shimmered in the heat, its vats of brine hissing and spitting as workers shoveled white crystals into heaps that sparkled like bone in the light. The air stank of salt, blood, and old sweat. Vultures circled lazily above, their wings catching the updrafts, waiting for the end of things. The townsfolk gathered in a slow, reluctant knot at the edge of the depot, their faces drawn tight, shaded by wide-brimmed hats and tattered bonnets. It wasn't bloodlust that brought them, but fear. Fear of the men standing near the gallows, of the crooked mayor with his potbelly and slick, sweat-greased hair, and of the Clayton gang, who ruled Ash Hollow as sure as any barbed wire fence boxed in cattle. No one crossed them. No one spoke out. And then there was her. Emmeline Rourke stood barefoot in the salt-streaked dirt, wrists bound tight with old rope. Her dress hung in tatters, stiff with blood and filth. One eye swollen shut, her lips split and trembling, and half her teeth gone, shattered under the fists of Mercy Boone and Ezekiel Clayton when the sun had gone down the night before. Her face might have once been kind, maybe even beautiful, but it was hard to see that now. The weight of her suffering pressed heavy in the still heat. She made no plea, no defense. None was allowed. Mayor Abram Voss read the charges in a thin, reedy voice. Theft of salt claims, adultery with a married man, and witchcraft, for good measure. The words hung like dust motes in the air, too worn and predictable to stir anyone's heart. Lies, all of them, and everybody knew it. Emmeline's crime had been marrying a man who wouldn't sell his land to the depot. And when Clay Rourke's body was found face down in a vat, his claim papers vanished. Voss and the gang spun their tale, and Emmeline's world crumbled. The gallows itself was little more than a beam set across two wagon wheels, a length of frayed rope dangling from it, swaying slightly in the heat ripple. The hangman was the depot's oldest worker, too bent to meet anyone's eye. Even the vultures kept their distance, as if sensing something was wrong in the marrow of this day. A murmur passed through the crowd, a name not spoken but felt, as eyes slid toward the distant canyon rim. A figure sat astride a dust-smeared mule, watching from the high ridge, a wide-brimmed hat shadowing his face. No one knew his name. No one dared ask. Some said he was a deserter from the war, others a hired killer. Some called him the Silent Ranger. But no one was sure if it was truth or a legend riding up there. He hadn't come to town, hadn't spoken a word, just sat there like a storm waiting to break. Emmeline's gaze drifted toward that high place as the noose was slipped around her throat, her bruised lips shaping something soundless. "Any last words?" Voss asked, his voice mocking, relishing it. She rasped, her voice raw. "Tell Clay. I kept the land." And then the hangman kicked the crate from beneath her. The rope was old, too brittle from salt air and years of sun. It didn't snap her neck clean. Instead, she dropped with a sickening jerk, her body twisting, boots scraping the dirt, a strangled gurgle in her throat. The townsfolk flinched, faces paling, a few turning away. The vultures rose suddenly, startled by something unseen. Down from the canyon came the stranger. He dismounted slow, dust rising around his boots, his silhouette cutting a sharp line against the glare. A long duster coat hung from his frame, sun-bleached and worn thin at the seams. No badge, no name, no invitation. Just a man moving toward the depot with the patience of death itself. The gang saw him coming. Zeke Clayton shifted his rifle. Walt Dunbar narrowed his eyes. Mercy Boone spat a stream of tobacco into the dirt, her hand on the pistol at her hip. Voss licked his lips. The stranger's boots crunched the salt underfoot as he neared. His face was rough, scarred, beard peppered with gray. Not young, not old. Just the kind of man you didn't mistake for anything but dangerous. Emmeline still hung there, her body twitching in weak spasms, life clinging to her through stubbornness or spite. The vultures had settled again on the roof of the depot, but at the stranger's approach, they lifted into the air in a sudden, startled flutter, scattering into the wide, empty sky. He stopped beneath the gallows, looking up at her. For a long moment, the only sound was the hiss of brine and the wind curling dry around the salt heaps. Then he spoke, his voice low and rough like a whetstone drawn across a blade. "Her shame ends now." No one moved. Not a breath, not a word. The words hung heavier than any accusation Voss had thrown. The stranger drew a long, narrow knife from his belt and cut the rope. Emmeline's body crumpled into his arms, limp but alive. He laid her gently in the shade of a broken salt cart. The crowd didn't interfere. Couldn't. Some stared at the ground. Some at the stranger. Some at the sky. Even Zeke's rifle stayed down, though his hand trembled on the grip. Voss found his tongue. "You don't belong here, stranger. That's a condemned woman." The stranger looked at him like a man deciding whether a rattlesnake was worth stepping on. "She's condemned by liars," he said. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even loud, but it cracked through the place like thunder. One by one, the townsfolk began to back away. Mothers clutching their children. Old men shifting toward their wagons. Fear changed shape in the crowd. No longer of Voss or the gang, but of something older, darker, patient, and relentless. The stranger's hand rested on the grip of a revolver, so worn it gleamed silver in the sun. The moment stretched taut, like a wire about to snap. And then, without another word, the stranger lifted Emmeline into his arms and turned his back on them all, walking away from the depot, from the gallows, from the town. No one dared follow. The salt air clung to Ash Hollow like a sickness, thick and sour, seeping into the walls, the soil, the people. Long before Emmeline Rourke's noose was strung, the town had begun its slow rot. It started after the army pulled out, the old frontier forts abandoned when the gold trail shifted and the railroads cut new scars across the land. Ash Hollow had been left a no-man's land between law and wild country, and it didn't take long for men like Abram Voss to fill the void. Voss was a merchant son from back east, soft-handed and sharp-eyed, with a voice like syrup and a tongue full of lies. When the soldiers left, he brokered deals with every cutthroat and drifter within 100 miles. He promised them a stake in the salt trade, free claim to whatever land they could seize, and no questions asked. Lawlessness dressed up as order, the kind of order you only got when the hangman's rope worked faster than a judge. The worst of them rode under the name of Clayton. Ezekiel Zeke, Clayton was a brute, a man built like a slaughterhouse bull, with hands that could crush bone and a grin that promised worse. He kept his hair slicked with axle grease and carried a hammer on his belt, not for building but for breaking things, skulls mostly. Walt Dunbar was the sniper, lean and pale as a bone, missing 3 fingers from a war nobody talked about. His rifle was an old Sharps, scratched and worn, but it still spoke death from any rooftop or canyon ledge. Dunbar didn't drink, didn't laugh, didn't miss. And then there was Mercy Boone. No one quite knew where she came from. A woman with a cruel streak wider than the prairie sky, drifter blood in her veins, and eyes the color of old pennies. She carried a skinning knife she called Sweet Nell, and had a habit of humming old lullabies before she cut a man. Rumor said she once strung up a boy for stealing her boots and left him for the wolves. They called themselves lawmen, enforcers of depot order, but the people knew better. You crossed them. You vanished. Your land, your wife, your life. All of it swept away like dust in a storm. Emmeline's husband had learned that too late. The day Jonas Creed rode into town, the vultures were already circling. No one knew his name then. Just a figure in a long, faded duster the color of smoke and old blood, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, shadowing a face carved by wind and war. Skin sun-baked, beard shot through with gray. His coat was stiff with salt crust and stains no rain could wash clean. A revolver rode his hip, a cavalry saber hung across a saddle, and his mule looked as worn and hard-bitten as its master. The people of Ash Hollow knew a kind of quiet terror when they saw it. Some said he was a bounty man. Others swore he was a soldier who deserted after the Red River campaign. But the oldest among them whispered a name long buried. Jonas Creed. A ranger once, they said. A man the Comanche called Ghost who strikes twice. Dead these 10 years, or so the story went, gunned down in a canyon ambush. And yet here he was, walking through their streets like some revenant, his silence heavier than a church bell toll at midnight. Jonas didn't head for the depot, didn't stop at the saloon or the mercantile. He made his way instead to the crumbling chapel at the edge of town, where no preacher had preached in half a decade. Inside, dust hung in lazy shafts through broken windows. The altar stood cracked and leaning. A single candle guttered in a rusted holder. He knelt there in the hush, striking a match, lighting a fresh taper beside it. No word spoken, just a flicker of flame and the faint scent of wax. When the sun bled red across the horizon, Jonas left the chapel and walked to the gallows where Emmeline hung, her body limp, a ragged shadow in the gathering dark. The last of the townsfolk had drifted home, and only the salt workers remained, their faces pale and lined with sweat, pretending not to see. Jonas cut her down. She hit the earth like a sack of dry corn, barely breathing, her face a ruin of bruises, lips split and teeth bloodied. Her fingers twitched weakly in the dirt. Jonas knelt beside her, brushed the hair from her face. There was no kindness in his touch, only a grim resolve. When he lifted her in his arms, the workers turned away. A child peeking from behind a salt cart was yanked back by a trembling hand. No one spoke. No one dared. He carried her through the dusk, past shuttered windows and empty streets, to an old miner's shack on the town's edge. The roof sagged. The walls leaned like drunkards. Inside, dust thickened the air, and a single cot lay in one corner. He laid her down, found a cracked jug of water, and began cleaning her wounds. Night claimed the town, the stars sharp and cold overhead. Emmeline came to with a ragged gasp, eyes wild, her body flinching from his touch. Don't, she croaked, voice thick with blood and salt. Jonas didn't answer. He cleaned the crusted blood from her lips, poured a mouthful of whiskey between them when she fought to stay conscious. She tried to push him away, weak and trembling. You can't help they killed Clay. Took our claim. Built the depot right over his grave, bastards, left me to swing for it. Her voice cracked. A single tear tracked through the grime on her cheek. Jonas said nothing. He offered no name. Just listened. At last, her strength gave out, and she slumped against the cot, breathing shallow. Outside, in the depot's lamplight, the Clayton gang gathered in the saloon, nursing whiskey and bloodlust. Zeke Clayton smashed his mug on the floor. I don't care who he is. He's dead by dawn. No man cuts down a rope I hung. Mercy Boone leaned against the wall, whittling a scrap of wood, her grin a wolf's. I say we take that girl out past the flats. Stake her down. Let the coyotes clean up the mess. Walt Dunbar spit tobacco juice into a brass spittoon. Best take the stranger quiet. I don't fancy trading lead with a ghost in the dark. Boone's knife gleamed in the firelight. Ain't no ghost. Just a man. And men bleed. Back in the shack, Jonas sat by the hearth, the fire's glow painting sharp lines on his weathered face. In his hands, an old cavalry saber lay across his knees, its edge notched, the grip wrapped in worn leather. He worked a whetstone along the blade, slow, steady strokes. The sound scraped through the silence. His thoughts drifted unbidden to the past. A younger man in a blue coat, cavalry boots crunching dry grass. The scream of a Comanche woman. Fire rising against a black sky. The sharp scent of blood and burning wood. A body crumpled in the dirt, hair like raven's wings, eyes wide and empty. He pushed the memory down like he always did, buried it deep, but it lingered in the edges of his mind like a thorn under the skin. The blade sang against the stone. Another stroke, another memory. Jonas Creed wasn't here for redemption, not for peace. He came for the same reason men like Zeke Clayton and Mercy Boone had drawn breath for death. The coyotes would eat well before dawn. The sky bled a pale pink at the edges of the world. The horizon cracked and dry, and the salt flats shimmered under the first threads of dawn. The chill of night hadn't yet given up its hold, clinging in the shadows of the crumbling shack where Jonas Creed knelt beside Emmeline Rourke. The woman's face was a ruin, one eye still swollen shut, blood drying at the corner of her mouth, teeth jagged and broken, but there was a spark in her eyes now. A fragile, angry light that hadn't been there before. Jonas reached inside his coat and drew out a tiny derringer, its pearl grip dulled with age. He checked the load, thumbed back the hammer, and placed it gently in Emmeline's trembling hand. She tried to close her fingers around it, but they were weak, clumsy. He steadied them with his own, silent, patient. "Hold it tight," he murmured, his voice low and rough as sandpaper. She looked up at him, some ragged thing between a sob and a breath catching in her throat. No thanks. No plea. Just the small, fierce nod of a woman who wasn't done yet. Jonas rose, slinging his saber over his back and checking the heavy iron at his hip. His duster hung like old shadow around him. He stepped into the weak dawn light, mounted his mule, and set off toward Ash Hollow alone. The town lay quiet under the weight of what was coming. A hush hung over the place, thick as gun smoke before the first shot. The vultures circled wide and lazy overhead, as if they too sensed a shift in the air. Zeke Clayton waited outside the salt depot, a shotgun cradled in his thick arms. He was chewing a sliver of wood, face twisted into a grin that showed too many teeth. His boots scraped dust as he shifted his weight, sizing up the stranger coming down the road. Jonas stopped a dozen paces out, dismounted, and let the mule wander. "Where's the girl?" Zeke called, voice carrying easy in the morning hush. Jonas said nothing, just rested his hand on the worn grip of his revolver. His eyes locked on Zeke's, unblinking. "Well, hell," Zeke chuckled, spitting into the dirt. "Looks like I get to plant two before breakfast." His hand twitched toward the shotgun, but Jonas was faster. A single, sharp crack split the dawn, and Zeke jerked, the hole in his chest blooming dark and wet. The shotgun tumbled from his hands as he staggered back a step, confusion on his face, then dropped like a felled steer into the salt-caked earth. For a moment, the town held its breath. Then came a second shot. Jonas felt it bite into the dirt by his boot. Walt Dunbar. The sniper was where Jonas expected him to be, on the depot's rooftop, crouched behind a stack of crates with that old Sharp's rifle in his hands. Jonas dropped low, rolling behind a salt cart. A third shot hit the wooden wheel with a splintering crack, white dust pluming into the air. Jonas scanned the ground beside him, spotted a sack of fine-ground salt, and slid it toward the cart's front wheel. Another shot struck close, peppering him with grit. He worked quick, grabbing a dry, rusted lantern from the side of the depot. The wick was long dry, but a scrap of his coat would do. He struck a match against the side of his revolver, the flame small and sharp. One breath. Two. Jonas heaved the sack upward, slashing it open as it went. Fine white dust filled the air between the cart and the depot wall. He lit the rag in the lantern, waited for Dunbar to line up his next shot, then hurled it into the cloud of salt. A flash like lightning cracked the dawn, blinding white. The salt dust ignited in a violent burst, a choking cloud of flame and grit. Dunbar screamed, a high, desperate sound, flailing from the rooftop. He hit the ground with a sickening crunch. Jonas didn't hesitate. A single bullet ended it. Across the depot yard, Mercy Boone bolted, skirts hitched up, hair wild. She screamed for Voss as she ran, vanishing around the corner of the mercantile. Jonas watched her go, then holstered his revolver. A figure appeared at the town's edge. Emmeline Rourke, staggering but upright, the derringer gripped tight in both hands. Her face was a map of ruin, but her eyes, they burned. Jonas stepped aside. Mercy Boone came barreling around the corner, skidding to a halt when she saw Emmeline. A cruel grin peeled across Boone's face. "Well, look at you," Boone sneered. "Little whore still breathing. Thought we'd left you for the buzzards." Emmeline raised the derringer, both hands shaking. Mercy laughed. "You think you can shoot me with that? You ain't got the sand." "I don't need sand," Emmeline rasped, her voice thick and cracked. "Just one shot." She pulled the trigger. The report was small, almost delicate compared to the thunder of Jonas's gun. But the slug hit Boone square in the chest, and the woman stumbled back, eyes wide in shock, one hand clutching the blood blooming beneath her shirt. Mercy Boone dropped in the dirt, dead before her knees hit the ground. The town was silent. The remaining townsfolk peered from windows, behind barrels and doors. No one moved. No one spoke. Jonas turned his gaze on the depot office, where Mayor Abram Voss stood frozen in the doorway, his pale, soft face sick with fear. His hands trembled as he tried to step back inside, but Jonas was already walking toward him. Voss blustered, his voice cracking. This is murder. I'll have the army. Jonas grabbed him by the collar, yanking him out into the open. Tell him. Jonas growled. Voss's eyes darted to the townsfolk, faces half hidden in shadow. He saw the looks there. Not of pity, not of fear, of quiet, waiting judgment. He knew his grip had slipped. Tell him what you did. Voss stammered, shaking his head. Jonas drew his revolver, cocking it slow. Now. And Voss broke. He confessed everything. The stolen claim, Clay Rourke's murder, the sham charges against Emmeline, the kickbacks, the bodies buried under salt heaps, the lies spun to keep the depot and the town under his thumb. The words tumbled out, greasy and desperate. By the time he finished, the townsfolk had begun to move. One by one, they stepped out into the yard. Men who'd been too afraid to speak, women who'd turned away, children clutching their mothers' hands. Somebody fetched a rope. They strung Voss up on the same gallows they'd meant for Emmeline. No trial, no sermon. The hangman refused to do it. So one of the depot workers stepped up, a man whose brother had vanished in the flats 2 winters ago. The noose tightened. Voss wept. The crate kicked out from under him. Jonas Creed watched without blinking. The sun had cleared the horizon now, painting everything in gold and blood. Emmeline Rourke stood beside Jonas, the derringer still in her hand. Her face was ruined, but she stood tall. Jonas spoke, his voice quiet, final. Her shame's yours now. Then he turned, mounted his mule, and rode toward the flats, leaving Ash Hollow behind. Ash Hollow was a different town by the time the sun set again. The vultures no longer circled the salt depot. The salt depot itself was gone, flames having eaten through its warped walls and rotten timbers. By afternoon, the townsfolk had gathered in silence as it burned, watching the smoke curl high into the cloudless sky. No one spoke. No one wept for the men who'd ruled them. The depot's ruin was the first clean breath the town had taken in years. They buried their dead. Zeke Clayton, Walt Dunbar, Mercy Boone, and Abram Voss went into shallow graves behind the old livery. No markers, no prayers, only dirt and rocks to cover them. The townsfolk kept their distance, shoveling without ceremony. Even the coyotes didn't linger by those graves. Out by the edge of town, Emmeline Rourke sat on the front step of the old shack, her face still a battered ruin, but her eyes clearer. She dabbed a damp rag against her cracked lip and flinched, but made no sound. The derringer lay beside her, its barrel cleaned, a single round loaded in its chamber. She wasn't sure if she'd need it again, but she kept it close. Inside the shack, Jonas Creed worked in silence. The roof had sagged and leaked through the last rain, and he was fixing it with a steady hand, nailing salvaged planks from the depot's storeroom into place. The scent of smoke and salt clung to his coat, his sleeves rolled up, revealing arms marked by old scars and sun-darkened skin. For 3 days, neither of them spoke much. Jonas moved like a shadow around the town's edges, patching fences, stacking wood, righting toppled stones. Emmeline cleaned the shack, mended what she could, and slept with one eye open. She could feel the old hurts inside her, like stones under the skin, but they no longer owned her. On the 3rd evening, they stood together at the edge of the salt flats, where the earth cracked into wide, pale stretches of dust and brine. Emmeline carried a bundle of wildflowers gathered from the sparse gullies, their color faint against the gray land. They'd marked the graves of the innocent, Clay Rourke among them, a simple wooden cross with his name carved by a hunting knife. The graveside air hung heavy with the weight of things unspoken. "I never got to say goodbye," Emmeline said, her voice rough and thin. Jonas crouched by the marker, pressing a hand to the earth like a man testing its warmth. He didn't answer. He loved this place. She went on, voice cracking. Said it was ugly and mean and hard as bone, but it was ours. They took everything. Jonas reached into his coat, pulled out a small, weathered locket. He turned it over in his palm before setting it in the dirt beside the cross. Emmeline glanced at it. Inside was a tiny, faded daguerreotype of a dark-haired woman, her eyes sharp and proud. Beside her, a much younger Jonas Creed in a cavalryman's coat. Emmeline's breath hitched. "Your wife," He nodded, and then, as if the words had waited too long to be told, the story poured out of him. He'd been a ranger, years before Ash Hollow had even earned its name. Rode with the frontier scouts, fought Comanche and bandits, men with skin painted like ghosts. He spoke of nights spent in ambush, days tracking war parties across scorched plains, of orders passed down from weak men who built peace with blood. His captain, a drunken, treacherous coward named LaRue, had betrayed their own, sold out a treaty to line his pockets, ordered Jonas to burn a village under the cover of dark. But Jonas had married one of them, a woman named Nala, brave and stubborn, with laughter like a creek in spring. When he refused, LaRue set the soldiers loose while Jonas was away on patrol. By the time he returned, the land was fire and death. Nala lay dead among the others, a bullet in her chest, their unborn child beside her. They buried her in the salt flats. Ash Hollow was built right over her bones. Jonas never went back to the Rangers. He left his badge in the dirt and took to the wild places. For years, he was a ghost, a name whispered in outlaw camps and border towns, the kind of man who didn't come for the reward, but for the reckoning. When the tale ended, the salt wind blew through the flats, stirring the dry grass. Emmeline's voice was soft. I heard stories, when I was little, about a man with a saber, who cut down men worse than devils. I never thought you were real. I was real enough, Jonas said, his voice a worn rasp. She looked down at Clay's grave, then at the burned horizon. I'm rebuilding this town, she said, starting with the claim. Not for them, not for salt or coin, for the ones they buried, for the ones they thought didn't matter. Jonas stood, dusted the dirt from his knees. Then you do it. Don't ask permission. Don't wait for men like them to bless it. Take it. I will. For the first time, she offered him a real, broken smile. What do I call you? She asked, knowing the answer before it came. Jonas Creed. She nodded. Good. The town will remember that name. I'll make sure of it. Jonas looked once more at Nala's grave, at the locket lying against the earth. Then he turned toward the rising dawn. No farewell, no promise to return, just the quiet step of a man done with one place, moving on to the next. By the time the first light caught the salt flats, Jonas Creed was a silhouette against the horizon, a figure swallowed by the endless wild. Ash Hollow would never see him again, but the name lingered, heavy as smoke in the wind. In the years that followed, Ash Hollow endured. The town that once cowered under the boot heel of outlaws and cowered slowly, found its spine again. The salt depot never rose from its ashes. In its place stood a chapel with whitewashed walls and a bell tower that caught the morning light, and beside it, a modest schoolhouse where the children of ranchers and widows learned their letters and how to aim a rifle straight. The name of Abram Voss faded from the records. The graves of Clayton, Boone, and Dunbar went untended, lost beneath wild grass and creeping salt. The earth itself seemed eager to forget them. At the heart of the town stood Emmeline Rourke. She bore the scars of those days plainly, a ruined mouth where teeth had been broken, an eye that never opened fully again. But there was no shame in it. She carried her wounds the way men carried revolvers, a mark of what she'd survived and what she would never allow again. The townsfolk named her mayor, sheriff, and matriarch all in one breath. No one questioned it, not after what she'd done. She rebuilt the claim, but not for profit. The salt trade no longer owned Ash Hollow. What came out of the flats was used to keep cattle alive in the summer, to preserve meat through the long winters, to trade fair with other towns. The blood price of those early days hung in the air like smoke, but with each passing year it lessened. Folks in the nearby settlements spoke of it in half-whispers. They talked of a place where justice had been clawed back from the dead hands of wicked men, where a woman's will had burned hotter than prairie fire, and where a stranger had walked through hell without flinching. They told stories, as frontier folk do, of the silent ranger who came when the innocent were wronged, a man with a saber at his back and a revolver that never missed. Some said he was a ghost. Others swore they'd seen him in 100 towns, always the same duster, the same hollow eyes, the same quiet, killing grace. No name given, but all knew it. Jonas Creed. Tales spread like wind across the plains, of a killer turned avenger, a shadow who brought death to the kind of men who made others sleep with one eye open. Children dared each other to say his name after dark. Drunkards swore they'd seen him ride through the canyons when the moon was thin, his voice carried on the wind. Her shame ends now. And every time some would-be tyrant tried to build a kingdom out of fear and stolen lives, someone would recall what happened in Ash Hollow, where the law was made by a scarred woman and a ghost with a saber. Years later, travelers claimed to see a lone rider moving through the salt flats at dusk, his mule steady, his coat trailing behind like smoke in the dying light. They'd say he was heading toward trouble, toward a town where a man with blood on his hands still sat fat in a saloon, or where a girl had disappeared without answer, and the law turned its face away. No one ever stopped him. No one ever asked his business. In the last light of day, with the horizon painted in deep crimson and the shadows stretching long, he would ride toward the edge of the world. And though no one heard him speak, those who claimed to listen swore they caught it in the hush between the wind and the sigh of the earth. A voice, old as bone and cold as iron. Her shame ends now.